This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's time for another MTG Top 10. The series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. But in some episodes of this series, especially lately, I've been looking at decks instead of individual cards, and that's what we're doing today when I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 most busted, block-constructed decks of all time. Between 1995 and 2017, Magic sets were released in blocks. Generally, these were 3 consecutive sets that were connected to one another through lore, mechanics, and themes. Starting with Ice Age block, which was completed in 1996, there were block-constructed formats where only cards from that one block were legal. These formats continued to exist as one of Magic's primary constructed formats all the way through to 2014, when block constructed was largely retired. You might think that decks couldn't be that busted with such a small card pool, but you'd be wrong. Especially because the small card pool also tends to mean that if there is one overpowered strategy around, it's kind of unlikely that there are enough answers to that strategy in those 3 sets. Obviously enough, the decks in this list and the order in which they appear is left up to my own opinion, but my opinion is based on just how dominant each of these decks was in their respective formats. After all, these were all decks that were so format warping that they required cards to be banned so that the format could be more balanced. As usual, this isn't a list about how these decks would fare against one another, just how dominant they were in their own time. Alright, let's take a look at my picks for the 10 most busted, block-constructed decks of all time. At number 10, I've got Ice Age Block Control. Ice Age Block was loaded up with tons of powerful control pieces, lots of amazing counter magic like Force of Will, and a powerful board sweeper and Yokel Hops. As good as those things are, though, there was an engine available in the format that made it impossible for aggressive decks to ever succeed. That engine was Thawing Glaciers and Zuron Orb. Thawing Glaciers is a land that enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 1 and tap it to search up a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then Thawing Glaciers goes back to your hand. When combined with Zuron Orb, this meant you could gain absurd amounts of life while leaving up all of your mana to interact. Thawing Glaciers also provided some great fixing, allowing this deck to be 4 or 5 colors. This engine would certainly be too slow by today's standards, but all the extra cards and extra life were an insurmountable obstacle in an era where creatures were much less efficient, and would have led to the format just being dominated by mirrors between this type of deck. As you can imagine, that's some of the most miserable Magic you could ever find yourself playing, so in the end they banned both Glaciers and the Orb out of the format. Even if you left one and not the other, the cards probably would have done enough to make things too hard for creature-based decks. So in the end, they both got banned. At number 9, I have Mono Red Aggro from TEMPEST block. TEMPEST was loaded up with amazing aggro creatures for the time. Jackal Pup, Mog Conscripts, and Wrathy Dragon were insanely efficient, and like most Mono Red decks, it was backed up by spells that do direct damage. One of the things that usually makes this type of deck beatable, though, is the fact that if you survive their initial onslaught and stabilize, you're probably going to win. Well, Cursed Scroll made it so that wasn't really possible. First you had to endure an insane curve out, and you'd think wiping the board would help you live at that point, but not with scrolls around. The scroll is a 1-mana artifact with an activated ability that you can pay 3 for and tap it. When you do, you choose a card name and reveal a random card from your hand. If the card you reveal has the right name, it does 2 damage to any target. When you first read that ability, it sounds like it would be kind of bad, right? But here's the thing. If you're an aggro deck that is emptying your hand to curve out, once you're in top deck mode, you can activate this every turn, name the 1 card you drew, and do 2 to your opponent, or their creatures. That quickly made it so your opponent had no hope of coming back. You would get their life total low with all of your good creatures, and then even if they managed to sweep the board, you would finish them off with the Scroll, which got even deadlier alongside Scalding Tongs, which effectively did 1 to your opponent every one of your upkeeps. In the end, Cursed Scroll had to be banned to make this type of deck less dominant. At number 8, I've got URZA's block Enchantment decks, which were powered by Serra's Sanctum. Unlike most of the decks on this list, this one didn't manage a top 8 at a major event. However, Serra's Sanctum did get banned because the deck was enough of a concern. This was especially true after they took action against 2 other decks in URZA's block. When they did that, they realized they needed to deal with this deck too, as it would have become the deck that dominated the format. Anyway, while URZA's block is often thought of as an artifact block, it was actually meant to focus more on enchantments. That, of course, is not really how it panned out, but you can still find some significant signs of this enchantment focus in URZA's block. Serra's Sanctum is one of them, obviously. It's a legendary land that can tap for 1 white for each enchantment you control. If you're playing some cheap enchantments, things can get out of control in a hurry. Other powerful enchantment payoffs in the block include Argothian Enchantress, which draws you a card when you cast an enchantment, Replenish, which reanimates all of your enchantments, and Academy Rector, which let you tutor up any enchantment when it died. Opalescence could also turn all of your enchantments into a win condition by animating them. In the end, they decided they needed to ban Serra's Sanctum to keep these enchantment decks from taking over the format. At number 7, I've got Gaia's Cradle Stompy, also from URZA's block. Kind of like with the Tempest mono red deck, URZA's block Stompy decks had a really amazing early game curve out thanks to aggressively costed creatures like Wild Dogs and Albino Troll. But then on top of that, there was also a completely insane card that pushed the deck to new heights. In this case, I'm talking about Gaia's Cradle, a land that can tap to add 1 green for each creature you control, and when you have this many cheap creatures, it can make a ton of mana in a hurry. You can use that mana to more easily pay for echo costs, effectively taking away the downside of cards with the keyword, and you could also use it to cast Might of Oaks out of nowhere for a quick win. The deck could even tutor up the all-powerful land with crop rotation, so gaining access to it every game was pretty easy. So in the end, Gaia's Cradle had to be banned to keep mono green decks from being too good in URZA's block. At number 6, I have Innistrad block tokens. Before there could ever be a block-constructed Pro Tour, Wizards of the Coast banned both Lingering Souls and Intangible Virtue. This was because token decks were absolutely crushing every Magic Online event for the format, and you can see why. Lingering Souls is a pretty insane card, capable of giving you 4 1/1 flyers at a very low rate, and Virtue's ability to buff all of your tokens is nuts. While Lingering Souls is definitely the best of these token generators, getting rid of it alone wouldn't have been enough, as the format had lots of powerful token generators in addition to that, including Gather the Townsfolk, Midnight Haunting, and Geist Honored Monk. So in the end, both had to be banned, as there would still be a powerful token deck if one or the other was left alone. At number 5, I have Frostbloom from Mirage Block Constructed. This was an insane combo deck, which is pretty funny. You would think that when they designed a block, it wouldn't be too difficult to avoid putting a busted combo in those 3 sets alone, but that's exactly what they did in Mirage Block. This deck looked to generate insane mana using Cadaverous Bloom, an enchantment that lets you exile cards from your hand to generate 2 mana at a time. This got particularly insane alongside Prosperity, an X spell that makes both players draw X cards. This meant you could just pump your mana into Prosperity, draw more cards, and keep exiling them from your hand to make more mana. Eventually, you'd find a drain life that you could use to kill your opponent. While Bloom is a 5 mana enchantment, so in theory, the combo should take a little while to get online, Squandered Resources made it so that wasn't really true. This 2 mana enchantment lets you sacrifice a land to add 1 mana to your mana pool. This can get you your Bloom down on turn 3, and at that point the game was pretty much over. In the end, Resources got banned out of the format, since once the combo was slowed down, it was a lot less insane. At number 4, it's another URZA's block deck. This one is Memory Jar. This one was banned out of existence before it ever had a chance to be played at a block Pro Tour, kind of like the Innistrad token decks. This is because they saw what was happening in Standard and Extended, where Memory Jar decks were breaking the formats. And in both of those formats, Memory Jar, Time Spiral, and Windfall were all also banned. The block version of Memory Jar wouldn't have been quite as insane as the standard or extended versions because it didn't have Megrim, which is what allowed you to win the game so quickly, since your opponent would have to discard at the end of your turn when you cracked your Memory Jars. However, having access to the Jar, Time Spiral, and Windfall still meant you could draw a really stupid number of cards far too efficiently, and when you can do that, you can find a way to win pretty much every game. That's why all 3 of these cards were banned in block. It is pretty funny that they realized these cards were busted in time. They probably thought they saved the format, but it turned out that they had many more problems that needed to be dealt with, as we saw earlier in the video, and as we're also going to see later in the video. Before we move forward, I want to say that the top 3 on this list are honestly pretty interchangeable. I had a hard time deciding what order to put them in, and I don't think I would fault anyone for putting them in any other order. However, these decks all dominated their own block formats to such a degree that they are really their own tier, even above the other insane decks we've seen so far. At number 3, we're taking a look at the last URZA's block deck to make the list. This time, it's the artifact decks in that format. These decks use the completely insane Tolarian Academy to generate massive amounts of mana. As I mentioned earlier, URZA's block was supposed to be about enchantments, but they printed a ton of completely insane artifacts and artifact payoffs in the block that don't really make it feel that way. This includes a whole bunch of crazy mana rocks, most notably Grim Monolith and Worn Power Stone. So in addition to stupid mana from the Academy, you had crazy mana rocks, as well as Voltaic Key, which lets you untap those mana rocks for an even greater mana advantage. This could allow you to do things like easily activate Temporal Aperture and cast Phyrexian Colossus very early. And the key could also untap the Colossus. There are even more stupid artifact payoffs around, including Tinker, which lets you tutor up any artifact you want and put it into play, including the Colossus, which was an absolutely frightening creature at the time. The URZA's Block Pro Tour featured 6 decks that ran both Voltaic Key and Tolarian Academy. One of the other top 8s was the Gaia's Cradle deck we saw earlier, and the other deck in the top 8 was packed full of artifact and land destruction to combat these Academy decks. That made for a format completely warped around a couple of powerful cards, so in the end, Academy and Voltaic Key both got banned. At number 2, I've got MIRRODIN Block Affinity. This was an artifact aggro deck that took advantage of the artifact lands. These are lands with both the artifact and land type. That may not sound super exciting at first, but it actually makes them completely insane because MIRRODIN Block is all about artifacts and can generate tons of value with them. For one thing, you have cards with affinity, like Mirror Enforcer, Thoughtcast, Somber Hoverguard, and Frogmite. For those, artifact lands effectively tap for 2 mana, and if you can play them out with other cheap artifacts, you can slam those affinity cards in the extreme early game. That isn't where things ended either, as almost every other card in the deck gave you value for doing things with artifacts like Arcbound Ravager and Disciple of the Vault, which formed a devastating combo. The Ravager can gobble up all of your artifacts, which includes pretty much all of your lands in this deck, and then it would get absolutely massive while the Disciple does 1 to your opponent for each artifact you sacrifice. This deck could end the game incredibly quickly as a result, and I still haven't even mentioned Skull Clamp, a completely stupid equipment that lets you draw a ton of cards while sacrificing your artifact creatures. Only 2 affinity decks actually made the MIRRODIN Block Pro Tour's top 8, but 5 of the other decks in the top 7 were built to beat affinity decks by running main deck cards like Shatter and Detonate. So the format completely warped around the power of affinity, and in the end, Skullclamp, the artifact lands, and Arcbound Ravager all got banned out of the format. And at number 1, I have Masques Block Rebels. At first glance, this deck looks weaker than the others in this top 3, but this list is about how much each of these decks warped their format, and none of the other decks on this list were quite as format warping as Rebels were. This was basically just a mono-white aggro deck, one that abused the Rebel creature type. Mini Rebels have activated abilities that let you search your library for another Rebel and put it directly into play. This definitely isn't exciting or an interesting design in any way, but it is powerful, especially in a block that had a fairly low power level. After all, you can just keep searching up Rebels every turn and move up a chain to overwhelm your opponent. The biggest offender of them all is the legendary Rebel Lyn Civvy Defiant Hero. Unlike other Rebels who have fixed mana values they can look for, Lyn Civvy has an X-costed version of the ability, and she can even put Rebels back in your deck, so after they die, you can search them up again. These Rebels were incredibly resilient and powerful, and led to the Masques Block Pro Tour top 8, including 6 Rebel decks, and 2 decks that were brewed with the explicit purpose of beating Rebel decks. If that's not a format being warped around a single deck, I don't know what is. Even the Academy deck in URZA's Block Constructed didn't quite reach the same level. Affinity decks did get closer to that level of format warping, but in that format, the anti-affinity decks were more successful than the anti-Rebel decks were in Masques Block. I think that's what makes Rebels the most busted block constructed deck of all time, and in the end, Lyn Civvy got banned, making Rebel decks a lot more fair. So, those are my picks for the most busted block constructed decks of all time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see more of my MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at decks, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.